Flight 417 had left Denver under a sky that could have been painted for a postcard. The kind of deep blue that pressed against the windows, bright and clear, promising an ordinary journey. Emma Reyes, smiling on autopilot as she pushed her beverage cart down the aisle, looked like every other flight attendant on the plane. Polite, calm, effortlessly professional. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight bun, uniform pristine, name tag gleaming. But the muscles in her forearms and the faint scars along her knuckles told a story that no uniform could hide. She poured coffee with precision, measured out cream, asked passengers if they preferred sugar, while her eyes flicked up at the cockpit occasionally, not from curiosity, but from instinct. No one noticed that her fingers twitched subtly every time the plane dipped or yawed, a subconscious mimicry of piloting movements. No one noticed the quiet way her mind mapped every movement of the plane, calculated every turn, and assessed every risk, even as she smiled at a passenger in seat 22A, handing over a cup with a practiced warmth. She was invisible by design, a ghost hiding in plain sight. "Coffee, ma'am?" she asked, voice gentle, as a middle-aged woman reached for the cup. "Yes, dear, thank you," the woman said, eyes closing briefly in relief, unaware of the tension behind Emma's steady hands. It should have been a routine morning, nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary, but Emma sensed it the moment the plane shuddered, not a typical turbulence. Something sharp, sudden, a lurch that rattled the metal skeleton of the plane and spilled coffee from her tray onto the linoleum floor. Emma's heart skipped. Her instincts flared. Years of training surged like an electric current she had long tried to ignore. She glanced at the cockpit door, which remained closed. The hum of the engines was uneven, too uneven. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was nothing, just a bump in the jet stream, but her gut refused to comply. Passengers murmured, their chatter rippling like static, nervous laughter trying to mask unease. A child in row 17 clutched a stuffed rabbit to her chest, eyes wide. Emma knelt to reassure the little girl with a smile, but her mind raced faster than the aircraft. A single pilot could handle this. A single coffee server. Not if the worst had happened. The call button chimed repeatedly from first class. Another lurch. A passenger yelped, gripping the armrest. Emma steadied the cart with one hand, masking her tension with her practiced, comforting smile. She reached to silence the call button mechanically but froze when the intercom crackled faintly, then went dead. Silence swallowed the cabin, heavy and unnatural. Passengers began whispering, glancing forward. Emma felt their eyes without looking. That's when she noticed it, the slight tilt of the plane, almost imperceptible but enough to set her nerves on fire. Her training kicked in, vivid as the day it was etched into muscle memory. She had been a pilot once, not just any pilot. Combat-trained, multi-engine, fighter-experienced. She had flown missions she'd never spoken of, missions that required split-second decisions that could mean life or death for dozens. Hundreds sometimes. And now, with the cockpit silent, her instincts screamed that her past was about to demand a reckoning. Emma parked the beverage cart awkwardly in the galley, her stomach tight, palms sweating despite the cool cabin air. She looked down the aisle. Passengers shifted uneasily, murmurs rising. A man in the exit row muttered, "What's going on back there?" Emma caught his gaze, offered a reassuring smile she didn't feel. Inside, a storm of calculations, maneuvers, and scenarios ran in her mind. She had left this life behind deliberately, walking away from adrenaline, danger, and authority, choosing the quiet invisibility of serving coffee over being responsible for hundreds of lives. But invisibility was a luxury she no longer had. The plane shuddered again, more violently this time, as if the sky itself were testing her resolve. The first officer's voice crackled through the speakers faintly, a garbled warning swallowed mid-sentence. Emma's stomach dropped. That wasn't a miscommunication. That was an incapacitation. An instinct told her the cockpit door would remain closed. She had to act. Her legs carried her down the aisle faster than any coffee-serving protocol would allow. Passengers instinctively stepped aside, sensing urgency, though none could understand it. Emma's hand shot to the cockpit door, knocking sharply. No response. Panic threatened, but she shoved it aside. Experience demanded precision. She tried the handle. Locked. Inside, a muffled thud reverberated through the metal walls. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Emma pressed her shoulder against the door, forcing the lock. Nothing. She keyed the emergency code into the keypad, hopping for a mechanical override. The door clicked a few inches but would not budge further. Her pulse surged. Memories of cockpit drills, emergency entries, and forced landings flooded her mind. She inhaled, exhaled, and keyed the code again, harder this time. Inches more gave way. Through the narrow opening she glimpsed chaos, instruments flashing red, lights strobing, and the unmistakable figure of the captain slumped forward. The first officer was unmoving. Passengers in the front rows had begun to stand, some shouting, some frozen in disbelief. Emma felt the weight of their eyes, hundreds of lives pressing against her shoulders like a storm she could not escape. She could either freeze, an invisible coffee server, or move, and she already knew she would. Taking a deep breath, Emma pushed the door open fully. Every step she took into the cockpit was measured, precise. She did not hesitate. Time slowed. The hum of engines, the beeping of alarms, the trembling of the plane, all converged into a single, urgent pulse that matched her own. Her hands hovered over controls she had not touched in years. A million calculations ran in milliseconds. Airspeed, altitude, throttle, flaps, weather, cabin pressure, fuel. Her eyes darted between instruments, past the cockpit windows, and then at the passengers who had no idea what awaited them. She could feel the weight of responsibility, her old life refusing to remain buried. Then a sudden, violent jolt shook the plane. Coffee sloshed in the cup left behind on the galley floor. A cry went up from the cabin. Emma's jaw clenched. She was no longer a server, not for anyone, not today. She looked at the unconscious pilots and then at the array of blinking lights and alarms, and she knew, if she didn't act now, this ordinary flight would become a tragedy. The training, the memories, the instincts all screamed at her. Emma Reyes, the coffee server no one noticed, was about to take control of a Boeing 737 with 200 lives on board. And as her hands finally gripped the yoke, steady and sure, the plane shuddered once more, and for the first time the passengers realized. This was no ordinary day. Emma Reyes sat in the cockpit, the yoke cold and familiar beneath her hands. The cabin behind her was a mixture of confusion and rising panic. She heard the muffled cries of children, the nervous laughter of adults pretending calm, and the clattering of an unsecured backpack skidding down the aisle. She could feel every movement, every tremor of the fuselage, every fluctuation of the engines as if they were extensions of her own body. Her mind ran through the checklists instinctively. First, assess the situation. The captain was unconscious, head slumped forward on the controls. The first officer wasn't moving, mouth slightly open, chest not rising. Emma quickly confirmed both pilots incapacitated. The blinking red lights screamed engine failure, altitude alert, and autopilot disconnect. Her throat tightened. She had left this life behind deliberately, and yet here she was, thrust back into a world she thought she had abandoned forever. The passengers' voices grew louder behind the cockpit door. Emma could hear a mother whispering assurances to her child, though her words carried no real comfort. Someone shouted, "Is the pilot okay?" The question lingered in the cabin like a knife. Emma wanted to answer, to reassure them, but words were useless. Action was the only answer. Her hands danced over the controls. The aircraft dipped slightly, then corrected itself, but not enough. She felt the plane's rhythm like a heartbeat, irregular, unstable. She keyed the microphone. Denver Center, Flight 417, pilot incapacitation. I am taking control. Her voice was calm, almost eerily so. Silence on the other end, then static, then a hesitant, incredulous voice. Confirm your qualifications. Emma took a breath, fingers tightening on the yoke. Former Air Force pilot, multi-engine, combat experience. I have the aircraft under control. There was a pause, heavy and uncertain. "Copy that, Flight 417. We are recalculating vectors." She nodded to herself. No one in the cockpit could see her, but the motion grounded her. Time moved differently now, slower, sharper, more precise. She checked instruments obsessively: airspeed, altitude, flaps, yaw, pitch, heading. The storm cell visible on radar was growing, dark and violent, like ink spreading across a map. Lightning flickered in the distance. Turbulence was building. She had to act, and she had to act fast. Emma's mind flashed back to her fighter jet days. Lessons learned in simulators and real combat: split-second decisions, precise timing, control under pressure. The cargo of this plane was not bombs or missiles. It was lives. 200 lives. And every second of delay could be the difference between survival and catastrophe. She activated the autopilot to stabilize the plane temporarily, but kept her hands on the yoke. One hand on throttle, one on controls, eyes flicking constantly between instruments and windshield. The first few moments passed in silence, punctuated by the occasional creak and groan of metal. The plane felt like a living creature, resistant, tense, waiting for her next move. Suddenly, the left engine alarm screamed, temperature rising. Smoke indicators flashed on a panel. Emma's stomach dropped, but her hands remained steady. She cut fuel briefly, adjusted throttle, trimmed the flaps, recalculated drag and lift. She could do this. She had to. There was no alternative. Behind her, the cabin erupted into murmurs and whispers of panic. Someone cried. Emma could hear the clanging of a drink tray dropped in fear. She tried to focus, blocking out the chaos. Panic was contagious, but she couldn't afford it. She toggled the radio again. "Denver Center, Flight 417. Engine 1 overheating. I need vectors for emergency landing. Repeat, emergency landing required." Static, then the calm but hesitant voice of an air traffic controller. "Understood, Flight 417. We have cleared airspace for you. You are certified." Emma's jaw clenched. "Certified to fly this aircraft. Copy." She didn't elaborate. They didn't need to know her full history, just that she could get them down safely. The storm ahead now appeared on the windshield, a wall of dark clouds lit with jagged streaks of lightning. She checked fuel reserves. Enough, barely. She had to act before weather conditions worsened. Her eyes flicked down to the passenger cabin camera feed. Faces pale, some gripping armrests, some holding each other, children clinging to parents. Emma felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her chest. She activated checklists from memory. Engine 1 failure, adjust fuel mixture, throttle balance. Flaps for approach, but not too early. Altitude correction, trim for pitch, stabilize for wind shear. Every calculation, every maneuver was precise, automatic, honed through years she had buried deep. Then another alarm, the cabin pressure warning. Oxygen mask still hadn't dropped. Emma's pulse quickened. She toggled the controls to stabilize cabin pressure and monitored altitude carefully. Too high, and oxygen loss would become critical. Too low, and turbulence would worsen the already compromised aircraft. She adjusted with a surgeon's precision. A sudden, violent bump threw her against the controls. She caught herself, chest pressed against the yoke, and took a deep, steadying breath. "Keep calm," she whispered aloud, more to herself than anyone else. The plane quivered again, and the cabin lights flickered, sending shadows racing across passengers' faces. A child's scream tore through the air. Emma's eyes locked on the horizon. Storm clouds, closer now, roiling with violence. She made a split-second decision. Descend quickly to escape the worst of the turbulence, but not so fast as to destabilize the aircraft. She adjusted the yoke, monitored airspeed, and trimmed the flaps for descent. The plane groaned under the maneuver, metal bending under forces it was never meant to endure. A voice behind her, someone leaning on the cockpit door, whispered, "Is she flying?" Emma didn't respond. She couldn't. Words were useless. Action was her only communication. The aircraft's nose dipped slightly, controlled, intentional, and she held it steady as the passengers gasped. Lightning split the sky, illuminating her face in a harsh white glow. Her jaw was set, eyes narrowed, and sweat trickled down her temple. She felt the full responsibility of the moment. 200 lives depended on her memory, her instinct, her skill. Then another jolt. Cabin items flew from overhead bins as the plane banked slightly. Emma adjusted instinctively, countering the tilt, stabilizing the fuselage. The left engine sputtered, smoke curling faintly from its exhaust. Her stomach sank, but hands remained firm. Denver Center, Flight 417. I need immediate vectors for nearest emergency landing. Engines compromised, 2 pilots incapacitated. The voice on the line hesitated. Copy that, Flight 417. Nearest airport is 15 minutes away, crosswind strong, runway short. Are you qualified? Emma's teeth gritted. I am, confirm approach vectors. The controller swallowed audibly, the tension over the radio palpable. Vectors confirmed. You are cleared for emergency approach. All emergency services alerted. Emma's eyes darted to the instruments. Speed, altitude, engine status, heading. She calculated time to landing. Every second mattered. The passengers behind her were oblivious to the full danger, yet she could feel their fear, their hope, and their lives resting in her hands. She toggled controls, adjusting the throttle and flaps with precision, compensating for engine imbalance and wind shear. Lightning flashed, illuminating the sky like strobe lights at a concert. Thunder roared, drowning out even the alarms inside the cockpit. The plane dipped again, violently, as if testing her resolve. Emma's pulse pounded. She could feel adrenaline coursing through her veins, unbidden but welcome. She had been trained for this, though never with innocent lives so directly in her care. Each calculation, each adjustment, was executed with the calm efficiency of someone who had no choice but to succeed. Then, as she stabilized the aircraft, a final warning flashed. Fuel running low, only enough for one more attempt at landing. A cold realization hit her. There was no room for error. One mistake, one misjudgment, and this flight would be the headline no one wanted to read. Emma Reyes, coffee server-turned-pilot, took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "Hold on, just hold on." The storm roared closer. The plane trembled. And somewhere in the cabin, a child whimpered, unaware that salvation had a familiar face, in uniform, pushing a beverage cart just minutes ago. Emma's hands gripped the controls, eyes locked forward. The cockpit was a symphony of alarms, warning lights, and raw fear, but she had control. And the next move she made would determine who lived and who did not. The cockpit smelled of metal, ozone, and the faint tang of fear. Emma Reyes' hands hovered over the yoke, muscles coiled and ready as the plane quivered under her touch. Outside, the storm loomed, a dark, roiling wall illuminated by erratic lightning. The Boeing 737, usually obedient and predictable, now thrashed like a living creature, testing her skill, her patience, her nerve. Behind her, muffled shouts and cries from the cabin pressed against the cockpit walls. She could hear a woman pleading with a child, someone clanging a dropped tray in panic, and another voice, low and trembling, whispering, "Is anyone in control back there?" Emma's lips tightened. The answer was simple, she was, and she had no time to waste. Her first instinct was to assess the pilots. The captain slumped forward, head against the controls, shallow breathing, eyes closed. The first officer didn't move at all, pale, rigid mouth slightly open. Emma's stomach twisted, but she knew checking pulses wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. Both were unresponsive, incapacitated. Her mind ran through emergency procedures she had drilled for years, in ways civilians couldn't imagine. She needed to take full control fast. "Okay, Emma," she muttered under her breath, eyes scanning instruments. "Just like training, just like training." The autopilot, barely functioning, shuddered as she toggled it to maintain altitude. She had a few seconds to breathe, plan, and act, and yet those seconds felt like lifetimes. The left engine warning flared red again, smoke faintly curling. She cut fuel momentarily, balancing throttle with precision, trimming the flaps to compensate for the plane's tilt. Every movement had to be calculated. Every misstep would cascade into disaster. Her hands moved like memory, reflex, instinct, muscle memory decades old but still razor-sharp. She toggled radio communications. Denver Center, Flight 417. Engine 1 overheating, Engine 2 stable. Requesting vectors for emergency landing. 2 pilots incapacitated. The voice on the other end hesitated. Flight 417, are you qualified? Emma swallowed. She couldn't afford words that sounded hesitant. Former Air Force pilot, multi-engine certified, I have control. There was a pause, heavy with disbelief. Then the controller's voice softened, tinged with relief. Understood, Flight 417. Emergency services alerted. You are cleared for nearest regional airport, short runway, crosswind strong. Emma's jaw clenched. One option, one chance. And the storm was accelerating, circling like a predator. She flicked a glance at the cabin cameras. Faces pressed against windows, some pale, some frozen in terror, some clutching loved ones. 200 lives, and she alone had the power to keep them safe. Lightning cracked across the sky, briefly illuminating the cockpit in harsh white light. The plane lurched violently. Emma's knuckles whitened around the yoke, sweat running down her temple, but her hands remained steady. She adjusted throttle, trimmed flaps, corrected yaw. Precision now mattered more than anything else. The plane rocked again. Thunder rolled, deafening, shaking the fuselage. Emma's pulse raced in tandem with the engines, uneven but alive. Oxygen levels in the cabin flickered on the warning system. Masks hadn't deployed yet, but she could feel the subtle drop in pressure. Too high, and passengers would panic or lose consciousness. Too low, and turbulence would destabilize her already delicate control. She toggled cabin pressure controls, adjusted altitude carefully, calculated rate of descent. All the while, the storm pressed harder, gusts pushing the plane off its course. She remembered drills, simulations, crashes she had narrowly avoided. Those moments were ghosts, but now they were tools, weapons she wielded to save lives rather than destroy. Just hold it together, she whispered, eyes fixed on the horizon. She could see the airport faintly on radar, but it was miles away and encased in storm cells. One wrong turn, one misjudgment, and the aircraft would spiral beyond recovery. Suddenly, the left engine coughed violently, sputtered, and then stabilized. Emma exhaled sharply. One small victory, but no room for celebration. She toggled throttle, adjusting to maintain a delicate balance. Wind shear hit hard, rolling the plane to the right. Cabin lights flickered violently. A child screamed. A woman screamed louder. Emma gritted her teeth, voice calm but firm. Brace, everyone brace for turbulence. She corrected the roll, stabilized altitude, and kept the yoke firm. Each adjustment was precise, controlled, measured, like dancing on a razor's edge. Behind her, the cockpit alarms screamed, lights flashing in chaotic rhythm. Emma ignored them. She couldn't do everything. She had to prioritize. Survival was the only metric that mattered. Her mind ran calculations she hadn't done in years. Glide slope, wind vectors, engine thrust, weight distribution, crosswind angle. One hand on throttle, one on controls, eyes flicking constantly between instruments and the storm ahead. She traced the path of the runway, memorized length, and calculated stopping distance. Short runway, crosswinds, one engine failing, and yet she had to land safely. The plane lurched again. She caught it, countering tilt, adjusting thrust, trimming flaps. She could hear the cabin shaking, passengers screaming, crying, some silent with fear. She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. Emma's thoughts briefly flicked to her old life, the missions, the air combat, the risk, the adrenaline. She had left it all, choosing a quiet life, pouring coffee, being invisible. And yet here it was, chasing her across the sky. She swallowed hard, centering herself. Invisibility was over. Now she was the lifeline. Another jolt, harder this time, threw her forward. She braced against the yoke. Engine 2 groaned faintly. Fuel indicators blinked dangerously low. Emma's stomach sank, but her hands remained firm. Calculations ran faster than thought. Descend quickly, avoid worst of storm, conserve fuel, align with short runway, stabilize for crosswinds, compensate for passenger weight shifts. She toggled the microphone. Denver Center, Flight 417. Final approach requested. Requesting confirmation of runway clearance. Static, then a voice trembling with awe. Flight 417 cleared. Emergency services standing by. You are proceeding at your own risk. Emma nodded. At least someone believed in her control, if only vaguely. She flicked her eyes to the cabin camera again. Faces pressed against windows, hands clutching armrests, some praying silently. She could almost feel their fear pressing against her spine. She thought, I will not fail, not today. Lightning split the sky again, illuminating the horizon like a strobe light. She adjusted throttle, trimmed the yoke, corrected drift. The aircraft rocked violently, metal groaning under stress. A drink cart tumbled down the aisle, passengers screaming, shouting, clinging to one another. Emma kept her voice calm, a low murmur over the intercom. Remain seated, stay calm, trust me. Her hands flew over controls as the plane lurched again, dangerously close to stalling. She corrected immediately, stabilizing altitude, trimming flaps, adjusting throttle. Engine 1 coughed again, sputtering faintly. Sweat poured down her forehead. The storm pressed harder, crosswinds growing stronger, turbulence violent and relentless. Emma's chest tightened. She calculated descent rate, airspeed, runway alignment. One mistake, one misjudgment, and the plane would overshoot the runway. She exhaled slowly, centering herself. Muscle memory, training, instinct, everything she had buried came alive. She was a pilot and she had to save lives. Then a sudden jolt threw the plane into a violent roll. Lights flickered. Alarms blared. Emma's hands tightened on the yoke. She adjusted, corrected, stabilized. But the runway was still far, the storm still looming, fuel still dangerously low. And the passengers, 200 souls, hung in balance, unaware of how close they were to disaster. Emma whispered to herself, almost inaudible over the roaring engines, focus, one step at a time, one move at a time. The plane shook again. She could feel the storm's teeth biting the fuselage. The cockpit was a cage of alarms, flashing lights, and chaotic energy. Emma's jaw set. She knew the next move would define the outcome. One chance, one attempt. And the storm, ruthless and unyielding, awaited her decision. Emma Reyes's hands gripped the yoke like it was an extension of her own body. The cockpit was a storm of blinking lights and screaming alarms. Outside, the sky had turned into a roiling, angry canvas of black clouds streaked with lightning, each flash illuminating the tense, pale faces of passengers who had no idea of the true danger hovering just inches above them. She could hear their muffled screams, the clanging of a dropped tray, and the whisper of prayers. She blocked it all out. Focus, survival, action. That was all that mattered now. The radio crackled again. Flight 417, confirm your intentions. Emma exhaled, steadying herself. I am commencing emergency descent to nearest regional airport, requesting vectors for immediate approach. Engine 1 failing. 2 pilots incapacitated. Static, then finally the air traffic controller's voice returned, shaky but clear. Copy that. You are cleared for approach. Winds high, crosswinds strong. Emergency team standing by. Proceed at your own risk. Emma nodded silently. She didn't need reassurance. She had a plane to fly. She glanced at the instruments, altitude 18,000 feet, airspeed holding but turbulence growing, fuel levels dangerously low, engine 1 still sputtering. The storm ahead was not letting up, and the runway, a mere strip of asphalt barely longer than some training field she had flown as a cadet, was waiting, ready to test her skill to the limit. She toggled the throttle, adjusting for the descent. The plane groaned under her commands, tilting slightly in response to the violent crosswinds. She adjusted rudder and ailerons, calculating weight distribution, drag, lift, and momentum in real time. Muscle memory carried her through a complex ballet of inputs, her mind running faster than any computer. The cabin camera flickered in her peripheral vision. She glimpsed a little boy clutching his mother's arm, eyes wide, terror etched across his small face. She felt a flash of guilt and determination wash over her. She had left this life behind, but invisibility was no longer an option. 200 lives depended on her. Every decision, every movement, every calculation mattered. Lightning split the sky again, the fuselage rocking violently. Emma corrected immediately, heart pounding, sweat dripping from her brow. The left engine coughed, sputtering, smoke curling faintly from the exhaust. She adjusted fuel flow, trimmed flaps, and corrected yaw. She could feel the plane resisting her commands, like a wild animal testing her resolve. She toggled the intercom, her voice calm but authoritative. "Everyone, remain seated, keep seat belts fastened, and brace for turbulence." The words were more for herself than the passengers. Her heart raced, but her hands never wavered. She could not afford fear, not now. Descending through the storm, visibility was almost zero. The runway lights appeared faintly on radar, blurred by sheets of rain and rolling clouds. She calculated approach vectors: speed, glide slope, wind angle, crosswind compensation. One misstep and the plane would overshoot or slide off the runway. She adjusted throttle, trimmed the yoke, and felt the aircraft respond under her touch. Suddenly, turbulence hit like a punch. The plane pitched sharply to the left. Emma corrected immediately, hands flying over controls, adjusting rudder and ailerons, countering the force. The cabin groaned as objects shifted and passengers gasped. Behind her, a woman whispered prayers under her breath. A child cried. Emma's chest tightened. Every life on board was a weight pressing against her spine. The left engine alarm flared again. She had no choice but to throttle back slightly, balancing thrust with the failing engine. Fuel consumption was critical. She ran calculations rapidly in her head. Descent rate, distance to runway, crosswind compensation, engine output. All variables had to align perfectly. Another jolt. Lightning flashed directly in front, momentarily blinding her. She instinctively banked slightly right, holding the glide path as the plane rocked violently. The control yoke felt alive, almost sentient, responding to her commands with a mix of resistance and compliance. She was no longer just a passenger or a server. She was the plane's lifeline. Her mind raced. Emergency landing procedures flashed through her memory. Approach checklist, flaps, throttle, airspeed, landing gear, trim, brake systems. She toggled the gear lever down and locked. A metallic thump confirmed the landing gear deployed. One step closer to survival, one step closer to the runway, one step closer to saving every passenger on board. The storm intensified. Winds shifted suddenly, slamming the aircraft sideways. Emma countered immediately, compensating for drift, adjusting throttle, trimming flaps. The plane lurched, cabin lights flickered, and passengers screamed. A woman yelled for her child, clutching him tightly. Emma's focus never wavered. She knew panic was contagious, but she could not let it distract her. Not now. Her eyes flicked to the instrument panel. Speed 180 knots, altitude 3,000 feet, runway distance calculated at 2.2 miles. Wind gusts at 40 knots, crosswind angle critical. She could make it, but only if she executed flawlessly. Another flash of lightning revealed the runway briefly. Emma lined up carefully, aligning the aircraft's nose with the centerline, adjusting for crosswind drift. She could feel every vibration, every subtle shift in the aircraft, every ounce of momentum. Her pulse matched the plane's rhythm. One miscalculation, one hesitation, and it would all be over. She spoke softly, almost to herself. Focus, precision, control. Her hands moved with mechanical perfection over the controls. Flaps extended incrementally, speed carefully balanced. She visualized the landing, step by step, maneuver by maneuver. Muscle memory and instinct guided her, bypassing fear, bypassing doubt. The turbulence intensified further. Wind shear slammed the fuselage, threatening to throw the plane off course. Emma fought it with every ounce of strength, yanking the yoke, adjusting throttle, trimming the plane back to alignment. The cockpit lights flashed like warning sirens. A muffled scream from the cabin punctuated the chaos. She ignored it, focusing only on the runway that shimmered faintly through the storm. Suddenly, the left engine faltered again, sputtering, threatening to stall. Fuel was low, reserves minimal. Emma gritted her teeth, compensating with the right engine, adjusting pitch and yaw. Calculations ran faster than thought, decisions compressed into milliseconds. This was no simulation. Lives were on the line, real, fragile, irreplaceable lives. The plane wobbled as crosswind struck again. Emma countered, correcting, stabilizing, maintaining glide slope. The runway appeared closer now, the lights barely visible through the torrential rain. She could feel her heart pounding against her chest. Sweat streaked her face, her uniform clinging to her, her hands shaking slightly, but her control never faltered. She whispered again, a mantra for survival, just a little further, just a little longer. Suddenly the turbulence hit its fiercest. The aircraft rocked violently, metal groaning. Passengers screamed, some panicking, some frozen. Emma's eyes narrowed. She held the yoke steady, countering each movement, adjusting throttle, trimming flaps, compensating for wind and failing engine. Inch by inch, she held the plane on course. Then, as if the storm were testing her resolve, a new challenge appeared. A gust of wind stronger than any before, threatening to push the plane off centerline. Emma reacted instantly, banking the plane slightly, adjusting throttle, stabilizing descent. The aircraft responded, almost reluctantly, but held. She could see the runway now, illuminated in patches by lightning. She calculated final approach vectors, brake timing, landing flare, crosswind correction. One chance, one opportunity. The passengers' lives rested entirely on her skill and composure. Her pulse raced, muscles tight. The plane quivered under her touch. And then, as the runway lights grew brighter, signaling the final approach, Emma's lips pressed into a thin line. She had one moment left before execution, one critical maneuver, and the world hung in fragile balance. Emma Reyes could see the runway now, lit in broken, storm-stricken strips ahead of her. Rain lashed the cockpit windows, each droplet distorting her vision like a warping lens. She adjusted the windshield wipers frantically, but they barely made a difference. The Boeing 737 was alive beneath her, resisting, trembling, testing every ounce of skill she had buried for years. One hand gripped the yoke, the other hovered over throttle, fingers ready to react to any fluctuation, any crisis. The turbulence intensified as she descended. Gusts slammed the aircraft sideways and the plane lurched violently. Behind her, the cabin screamed, and the vibrations made it hard to hear even her own thoughts. Emma ignored it, focusing entirely on instruments, glide slope, and runway alignment. She had one chance, one opportunity to bring this plane safely down. One misstep and 200 lives would end in an instant. She toggled the flaps incrementally, bringing the aircraft into a delicate configuration for landing. Crosswinds whipped at the plane, threatening to push her off course. Engine 1 sputtered intermittently, a harsh reminder that time was against her. She leaned forward slightly, jaw tight, eyes scanning every meter of runway appearing beneath her. "Almost there," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Muscle memory kicked in. Her body remembered every maneuver, every emergency descent, every precision approach she had executed in the Air Force. But this was different. This wasn't a drill. This was real, real people, real families, real lives. And she was the only one standing between survival and disaster. The plane pitched slightly, buffeted by wind. Emma adjusted immediately, correcting the roll, trimming the yoke, keeping the nose aligned with the runway. She watched the runway lights flicker in the storm, counting each one like a heartbeat. Inches, she told herself. Inches meant the difference between success and failure. Suddenly, a violent gust hit, slamming the plane to the right. Emma countered instantly, fighting the controls with every ounce of strength. Engine 1 sputtered again, smoke curling faintly from the exhaust. Fuel levels were perilously low. She had to land now. Delay meant running out of power, running out of time, running out of lives. The runway came closer. She flared the plane slightly, preparing for touchdown. The landing gear had deployed, wheels ready to meet asphalt. She adjusted throttle, balancing descent rate, speed, and alignment. The first tentative bump against the tarmac rattled the plane violently, throwing a shock through the fuselage. She held the yoke firm, absorbing the tremor, and gently lowered the nose. Passengers gripped armrests, gasping, clutching loved ones. A child screamed, a man muttered prayers, another passenger whispered, "Please let her make it." Emma's eyes remained locked forward, scanning instruments, runway, and horizon. She had no time for doubt, no room for error. The plane bounced on landing once, then twice, metal groaning with each contact. She corrected yaw, adjusted throttle, and stabilized the plane for the roll down the runway. But the crosswinds were relentless, tugging the aircraft sideways. Emma countered, banking slightly, steering with precision, trimming continuously. Every muscle in her body screamed, but she ignored it. Concentration was survival. Suddenly, the left engine gave a violent cough and faltered, threatening to stall completely. The plane shuddered. Emma's heart pounded, but her hands never wavered. She had seconds, maybe less, to compensate. She throttled the right engine carefully, adjusting flaps, correcting pitch. She fought gravity, wind, momentum, and mechanical failure simultaneously. The plane skidded slightly as the tires met wet asphalt. Sparks flew faintly where metal met friction. Emma's pulse raced. She had trained for emergencies, but never like this, never with real lives at stake. She adjusted the rudder, realigned the nose, and pushed the brakes gradually, ensuring the aircraft remained on course. Cabin alarms blared as loose objects shifted. Passengers screamed, some crying, others gripping each other desperately. Emma toggled the intercom, voice calm but firm. "Stay seated. Keep belts fastened. We're landing. Brace for impact." Her words were grounding, but the truth was simple. The landing wasn't over yet. The plane bounced again, rocking violently. Emma countered immediately, adjusting throttle, trimming yoke, banking slightly against the crosswind. Engine 1 sputtered again, smoke curling from the exhaust. Fuel warning blinked ominously. She had no more margin for error. One more misstep and the plane could skid off the runway or worse. Emma focused on the runway's centerline, watching the distance shrink beneath her. She calculated braking distance, adjusted speed, monitored reverse thrusters, and compensated for wind gusts. The aircraft groaned under stress, every bolt, every joint tested by the storm and the emergency landing. Lightning flashed, illuminating the trembling cabin and wet runway. Thunder roared like artillery. Emma felt a momentary pang of fear, a visceral human reaction, but pushed it aside. She had no choice. This was not the time for hesitation. The plane touched down firmly again, the wheels screeching against asphalt, braking slowly but steadily. Emma kept throttle steady, steering the plane with every ounce of precision. She could feel the aircraft slowing, the momentum decreasing, and yet the runway stretched too short beneath her. She fought panic, adrenaline, and exhaustion simultaneously. She toggled reverse thrusters, keeping the plane straight. The nose wobbled slightly, caught again by wind gusts. Emma corrected, her hands trembling but exact. Sparks flew faintly under the wheels, cabin lights flickered, and passengers gripped seats in terror and hope. Inch by inch, the plane slowed. "Almost, almost," Emma whispered, counting every meter. Brake pressure calculated perfectly, flaps adjusted to maintain balance. She guided the plane like a surgeon, steering the living, thrumming metal toward safety. The plane bounced one final time, then began to slow steadily. Emma exhaled almost imperceptibly, hands still gripping the yoke, eyes scanning instruments until the last meter. The runway stretched out, rain pouring down, crosswinds whipping, but she kept the aircraft under control. Then a sudden, violent gust threatened to push the nose off the tarmac. Emma's pulse spiked. She countered immediately, nudging rudder, trimming flaps, adjusting throttle. The plane wobbled but stayed aligned. The runway lights blurred under rain. She pushed brakes harder, reverse thrust engaged fully. The aircraft slowed, finally obeying her commands. Inch by inch, meter by meter, it came to a full stop. Sparks fizzled out. Tires screeched once, then rolled smoothly on wet asphalt. Emma exhaled fully for the first time since boarding. Her hands were clammy, muscles tight, heart hammering like a drum. 200 lives had survived because of her skill, her courage, her instinct. The cabin erupted cheers, cries, gasps of relief, and the quiet sobs of those who realized they were alive. Emma unbuckled, still in the cockpit, and let herself sink slightly in her seat. She hadn't fainted. She couldn't. The adrenaline was still roaring. She glanced at the captain and first officer, still unconscious, and at the array of blinking instruments. Someone pounded on the cockpit door. A flight attendant leaned in, eyes wide. You did it. Everyone's alive." Emma nodded, voice low, hoarse. "Yes, everyone." Then in the chaos outside the cockpit, she realized she hadn't noticed the blood on her knuckles, the sweat-soaked uniform, the trembling of her legs. Her hands still gripped the yoke, instinctively. 200 lives, a storm, a failing engine, and she had survived. And now the weight of what she'd done pressed down on her. Emergency vehicles swarmed the runway, lights flashing, sirens wailing. Passengers began to disembark slowly, hugging loved ones, crying, laughing, overwhelmed by relief. Emma remained in the cockpit a moment longer, letting herself absorb the reality. She had not only taken control, she had saved everyone. And then a hand touched her shoulder. One of the medics, looking astonished, whispered, You're the coffee server." Emma's lips twitched in a tired, exhausted smile. "Not today," she said, voice barely audible over the rain and engines cooling. The rain had stopped, leaving the tarmac glistening like a silver mirror under the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. Emma Reyes remained in the cockpit a few moments longer, letting the hum of cooling engines and the chaos of relief wash over her. She flexed her hands, still trembling from tension, and leaned back in the pilot's seat. 200 lives had been saved, yet the adrenaline refused to release its grip. Through the cockpit window, the runway swarmed with activity. Paramedics moved swiftly, checking passengers, while firefighters tested the plane for residual hazards. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted into microphones, and officials ran toward the aircraft with notebooks and clipboards. The storm had passed, but another one was about to hit. Scrutiny, questions, and curiosity. A flight attendant finally entered the cockpit, breathless. "Emma, everyone there okay? You actually did it." She nodded numbly, voice hoarse. "I just did what needed to be done." Her words carried humility, but inside she was spinning. She had left a high-stakes life years ago for invisibility, for normalcy, for peace. And yet here she was, thrust back into a spotlight she never wanted. The reality of what she had done, and what it would mean, was starting to sink in. The medics motioned for her to step out. As she unbuckled and opened the cockpit door, she was hit with a flood of faces, passengers cheering, crying, hugging, and shaking. One elderly man clutched her hands tightly, tears streaming down his face. You saved my granddaughter," he gasped. Emma's chest tightened. Words failed her, so she nodded, forcing a small, tired smile. From the corner of her eye, she noticed reporters gathering at the perimeter, cameras flashing like relentless lightning. Authorities were approaching, clipboards in hand. Questions were inevitable, and Emma wasn't sure how she would answer them. She had no official role, no credentials for this type of heroism, at least not anymore. And yet, every life on board bore her mark. A uniformed officer stepped forward, voice steady but incredulous. "Ma'am, are you saying you piloted this aircraft?" Emma's lips twitched. "Yes, I am trained. I am a former Air Force pilot." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The look of disbelief on the officer's face was enough. Passengers surrounded her, some shaking her hands, others patting her shoulder. A young boy, perhaps 7 or 8, hugged her leg, whispering, "You saved us." Emma bent down slightly, stroking his hair gently. Her heart ached with relief and exhaustion. She had not only survived but carried everyone through a storm she never should have faced as a civilian. The emergency teams ushered her toward a waiting vehicle. Cameras clicked incessantly, recording every exhausted, drenched movement. Emma's mind raced, not with fear now but with the weight of reality. Media, officials, and passengers were converging. Questions would come. How did a coffee server take control of a Boeing 737? Why had she been invisible for so long? And most importantly, how had she done what seemed impossible? In the waiting area, she finally allowed herself to sit. Her uniform was soaked through, her hair plastered to her scalp, sweat and rain mingling into a sheen on her face. The adrenaline that had carried her through the crisis now crashed into exhaustion. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the weight of the past hour press against her. A reporter approached cautiously, microphone extended. "Miss Reyes, can you explain? How did you manage to land the plane with both pilots incapacitated?" Emma inhaled slowly, composure returning. "I trained for this years ago. I was a pilot in the Air Force. I have experience with emergency situations. Today, it became a matter of survival." The reporter leaned in, eyes wide. "But you were a coffee server. Nobody knew. How is that possible?" Emma's lips pressed into a thin line. "People hide parts of themselves," she said softly. "Sometimes for safety, sometimes for peace. Today, those skills saved lives." Authorities approached, notebooks and tablets ready. An investigator spoke first. "We need a full statement. We'll need flight records, credentials, everything. Can you provide those?" Emma nodded. "I'll cooperate." Her voice was calm, but inside she braced for what was coming next, the exposure. For years she had hidden her history. She had abandoned a life of high-stakes missions, adrenaline and responsibility for one of normalcy. And now she was about to be thrust back into the world she had left behind. One of the medics whispered, "People are calling you a hero. They're already talking about it on social media." Emma blinked. Social media. Already, within minutes her face and name would be plastered across news feeds, screens, and discussions. She had survived the storm, saved 200 lives, and now her anonymity was gone. She had always valued invisibility. Now it was shattered. A passenger walked over hesitantly. I just want to say thank you," the man said, voice trembling. "You kept us alive. My wife, my daughter," he trailed off, choking on emotion. Emma's chest tightened. She nodded, trying to smile. Words were useless. Actions had spoken louder than anything could. The authorities began asking for statements, recording her recollection of events, asking technical questions about the aircraft, instruments, and maneuvers. Emma answered meticulously, drawing on every ounce of memory, every lesson from her past life. She explained the approach, the handling of crosswinds, the engine failure, and the landing. Each word was measured, deliberate, a testament to the precision that had carried her through the storm. Outside, news helicopters began circling, cameras trained on the aircraft. Reporters were already broadcasting live, speculating, and asking questions about the mysterious coffee server who had suddenly become the savior of 200 lives. Emma could hear snippets of conversation carried on the wind. Hero, miracle landing, former pilot. The reality was settling in. Her secret life, the one she had abandoned for peace, was now public. Every training session, every combat mission, every skill she had buried for years was now a headline. She had survived the storm, saved countless lives, and now faced a new challenge, surviving the scrutiny that would follow. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it initially. When she checked, it was messages from former colleagues, pilots she had flown with, people who knew her skill, her history. "Saw the news," one read. "Incredible, you did it." Another, "Thought you were gone, but you saved lives today. Proud of you." Emma exhaled, letting herself lean back. Relief mingled with exhaustion and apprehension. She had saved lives, yes, but the storm outside the cockpit had ended only to be replaced by the storm of public attention, questions, and curiosity. The first passengers began to leave, hugging loved ones, crying, smiling. Emma stayed seated for a moment, letting herself absorb the enormity of the moment. She had faced the storm, navigated impossible odds, and brought everyone down safely. But what would come next? Recognition, scrutiny, perhaps even consequences. Her anonymity was gone. The world now knew who she was and what she was capable of. A voice from behind startled her. "Miss Reyes, emergency services want to debrief you." She nodded slowly, standing. Each step toward the waiting officials felt like crossing another threshold, from anonymous coffee server to national hero, from invisible civilian to pilot, savior, and spectacle. And as she walked, flashes from cameras caught her in the rain-soaked uniform, eyes tired but determined, hands still trembling slightly from adrenaline. She realized the story of Emma Reyes, the coffee server who had piloted a Boeing 737 to safety, was about to become larger than her, larger than the storm, and larger than she could have ever imagined. The airport terminal was chaos wrapped in controlled urgency. Reporters crowded around, microphones thrust forward, cameras clicking, flashes illuminating Emma Reyes' rain-soaked uniform. Social media had exploded. Videos of the landing were going viral before anyone even had time to blink. On screens across the country, a coffee server, an ordinary civilian, was suddenly the center of an extraordinary story. She walked briskly, escorted by officials, toward a conference room where statements were being taken and interviews were scheduled. Her mind was a whirlwind of exhaustion and adrenaline. The calm precision that had guided her plane down the stormy runway was gone now, replaced by a tidal wave of public attention and scrutiny. She had survived a storm, yes, but now another storm raged, this one of questions, cameras, and unrelenting curiosity. A line of passengers had formed in the terminal, many seeking to thank her personally. She smiled tiredly, nodding and shaking hands, though each interaction drained a little more of the energy she still hadn't fully released. The elderly man who had gripped her hands moments earlier now pressed a small card into her hand, eyes wet. "For you, for saving our family. We'll never forget this." She slipped it into her pocket, heart tight with emotion, knowing gestures couldn't fully convey the weight of what had occurred. Authorities approached, clipboards in hand. Questions came fast, precise, demanding exactitude. "Flight logs, credentials, official clearance," Emma answered carefully, explaining her Air Force background, her qualifications, and her emergency decision-making during the flight. Every detail mattered. Every word could be scrutinized, dissected, and published. Her anonymity, already fragile, was dissolving rapidly. Meanwhile, the media outside had begun their frenzy. Reporters shouted questions through the glass doors, microphones extended, cameras rolling. "Miss Reyes, coffee server or secret pilot, how did you do it? Are you a national hero? Why did the airline allow an unlicensed passenger to take controls?" Each shout pierced the controlled calm she tried to maintain. Her phone vibrated again. Messages flooded in, texts from former colleagues, former instructors, and distant friends she hadn't spoken to in years. "We saw incredible work. You saved hundreds, don't let them stress you out. Call me, now." Even the Air Force contacts she had left behind were reaching out. Emma felt a pang of nostalgia. Her past had returned with a vengeance. One reporter slipped past security and shoved a microphone in front of her. "Miss Reyes, did you ever imagine you'd be a hero? Were you afraid?" She looked directly into the camera, eyes steady despite the storm inside. "Fear is natural," she said, "but action is necessary. Today, it wasn't about me. It was about every single person on that plane. That's all that mattered." Her words were simple, measured, but carried the weight of someone who had faced life-and-death decisions and survived. Officials ushered her toward a quieter conference room, away from the clamoring crowds. Here, she faced airline executives and investigators. Questions now became sharper, almost accusing. Why didn't the pilots maintain control? How did you gain access to the cockpit? What emergency procedures did you follow? Emma answered methodically, recounting each step of the emergency descent, every maneuver, every calculation she had executed. The executives leaned forward, astonished. "You're telling us that a former Air Force pilot, now serving coffee, took control and landed a Boeing 737 with failing engines and both pilots incapacitated?" Emma nodded, voice steady despite her exhaustion. "Yes, I had the skills. I made the decisions necessary to save lives." The room went quiet for a moment, and then the questions shifted. Why weren't you on duty as a pilot? Why didn't anyone know? Emma hesitated. The truth she had carried for years weighed heavily. She had left that life behind, deliberately erasing herself from the high-risk world she once commanded. "I left that life," she said softly. "I chose peace, anonymity. But when lives were at risk, I could not stand aside. I did what was necessary." Outside, the public reaction was already in full force. Social media channels exploded with admiration, speculation, and disbelief. Memes and videos of her landing spread like wildfire. People debated her story, questioning whether it was real, heroic, or even possible. Every news outlet was calling her. Every headline demanded answers. Every person wanted a piece of the mystery that had become her. The airline arranged a press briefing. Emma sat behind a podium, still wet from the storm, her uniform a visible reminder of the chaos she had just survived. Cameras rolled, lights flashed, and microphones pointed toward her like arrows. She took a deep breath. 200 lives had been saved, yes, but now the world wanted explanation, narrative, heroism, drama. She spoke slowly, deliberately. "I am not a hero," she said, surprising some reporters. "I am someone who had the training to act when no one else could. Today, I used every skill I learned to ensure every life on that plane survived. That's all. 200 people are alive, and that is what matters." Questions fired at her relentlessly. Do you regret leaving the Air Force? Will you return to aviation? Did you fear the storm? How did it feel to be invisible until this moment? Emma answered calmly, though fatigue and adrenaline tugged at her composure. "Leaving was my choice. Returning to the cockpit wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. Fear is natural, but action must follow. I didn't act for recognition. I acted for lives." After the briefing, officials escorted her to a private room. Here, the storm of public attention faded slightly, replaced by quiet and the hum of emergency systems winding down. She sank into a chair, hands still trembling. 200 lives had survived on her skill alone. And yet, she felt an unfamiliar weight, the exposure of her hidden past. Her phone buzzed again. It was a secure message from a former Air Force commander she hadn't spoken to in years. "We saw. Incredible. Are you okay?" She typed back simply, "Alive, exhausted, and the world knows now." The door opened. A young flight attendant stepped in, holding a coffee cup she didn't ask for. "For you," the woman said softly. "You kept all of us alive. Everyone's talking about you." Emma allowed herself a small smile, accepting the cup. Hot liquid in her hands grounded her briefly, reminded her of the life she had chosen moments ago, simple, quiet, serving others. But even in that simplicity, she knew the spotlight would never leave her now. She looked out the window at the rain-streaked runway. Emergency vehicles still lined the tarmac, lights flashing. The storm had passed, but its aftermath was far from over. Social media was alive. Media helicopters circled overhead, and officials had only begun piecing together her extraordinary actions. Her life, once private, had exploded into public scrutiny in mere minutes. Emma thought of the passengers, their families, the little boy who had hugged her leg on the runway. Her chest tightened with the memory. She had been invisible. Now she was everywhere. And yet, for all the attention, all the recognition, she felt only one certainty. She had done what she had been trained to do. She had acted. She had saved lives, and nothing else mattered, not yet. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. 2 officers entered, serious expressions. "Miss Reyes, we need to discuss formal debriefing and official statements. Also, there's interest from national security and the FAA regarding your qualifications." Emma nodded slowly. Her life of anonymity was gone. The hidden years, the quiet life, the coffee shop she had poured herself into, all of it now collided with her past. Her heroism had revealed her identity, and with it, countless doors she had never expected to reopen. As the officers outlined procedures, the weight of reality pressed down. Interviews, statements, potential media appearances, FAA investigations. She had survived the storm and landed a plane with failing engines, but now the storm of consequences loomed even larger. And somewhere deep in her mind, a quiet, stubborn thought emerged. She had survived before. She would survive again. But even as that thought anchored her, she knew this. The story wasn't over. The world wanted answers, secrets were about to be revealed, and the final chapter, her full reckoning, was yet to come. The morning after the landing, Emma Reyes sat in a quiet conference room, the hum of air conditioning and distant chatter of airport staff filling the space. Her uniform was pressed and clean now, but the weight of the past 24 hours pressed down like a storm that refused to dissipate. She had survived the impossible, saved 200 lives, and now faced the consequences of exposure. The world knew her secret, the coffee server who had once been a fighter pilot. Across from her sat airline executives, FAA officials, and investigators, all armed with clipboards, digital tablets, and an insatiable curiosity. Every question was meticulous, professional, and heavy with expectation. "Miss Reyes," one official began, "we need a full report of the flight. Step by step, minute by minute. Any deviation from protocol must be documented." Emma nodded, hands folded in her lap. "I understand, I'll provide everything." Her voice was steady, but a quiet tremor ran through her fingers. For years she had hidden this life, left it behind. Now she was forced to relive every maneuver, every split-second decision, every fear, every calculation. The questions came fast, but Emma answered each with precision. She described the initial engine failure, the incapacitation of the pilots, the turbulence, the storm, the crosswinds, the calculations she made for descent and alignment. She spoke of muscle memory, of Air Force training, and the instincts that had guided her hands through the chaos. Every word was a bridge between secrecy and truth. After the initial debrief, a journalist requested an interview. Emma agreed, understanding the inevitable. Cameras rolled. "Miss Reyes," the reporter said, eyes wide, "the nation is in awe. How does it feel to be called a hero overnight?" Emma paused. She hadn't considered the word, hero. She thought of the terrified faces of passengers, the prayers whispered in fear, the child who had clung to her leg. "I didn't act to be a hero," she said finally. "I acted because I had the skills and the responsibility to act. 200 people's lives were in my hands. That's all that mattered." The camera flashed. Social media exploded with the statement. News channels replayed her calm, composed face, juxtaposed against the viral footage of the landing. "Coffee server or secret pilot" became the trending headline. Memes, hashtags, and commentary erupted nationwide. Emma's life of anonymity had ended, replaced by a new reality: scrutiny, curiosity, admiration, and expectation. A knock at the conference room door interrupted her thoughts. A uniformed officer stepped in, saluting briefly. "Miss Reyes, the Air Force would like to speak with you. They're aware of your actions and want to debrief you formally. They've also expressed interest in discussing your possible return to active service, if you're willing." Emma felt a mixture of disbelief and nostalgia. Years ago she had left that world, choosing peace, invisibility, and simplicity. She had poured coffee, served strangers, and tried to erase the life of adrenaline, risk, and responsibility. And now, suddenly, it was calling her back. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her composure. She nodded slowly. "I'll speak with them." Outside, the airport had become a theater. Passengers shared their stories, hugging reporters, replaying the miraculous landing over and over. Social media was a river of admiration and disbelief. But amidst the attention, Emma felt a quiet tug, responsibility. Her actions had consequences beyond the immediate rescue. She had inspired, reassured, and terrified a nation simultaneously. And the world wanted more answers, more details, more hero. The debrief with the Air Force was both formal and intimate. Former colleagues, mentors, and commanders, some she hadn't seen in years, greeted her with restrained awe. They asked technical questions, dissected the landing, praised her calm under pressure, and probed her choices. Emma answered each with measured honesty, describing the storm, the engines, the passengers, and her own internal calculations. Finally, one senior officer leaned back, eyes gleaming with pride and curiosity. "Emma, you left this world willingly, but today you reminded all of us why you were extraordinary. You acted decisively, brilliantly, and selflessly. You've saved lives in a way few could imagine. The nation owes you, and so do we." Emma exhaled, her shoulders loosening slightly. The acknowledgement, while gratifying, carried a weight. She had wanted invisibility, simplicity. Yet her skills had demanded recognition, and she could not escape the life she had once known. Returning to the terminal later, she was met with a wave of emotion. Families she had saved recognized her, tears streaming, voices quivering. "Thank you," they said again and again. Children waved small drawings of planes, letters of gratitude, tiny tokens of life preserved. Emma accepted them silently, overwhelmed by the tangible weight of her actions. The media frenzy continued. Interviews, live broadcasts, and social media speculation blurred together into a relentless tide. Every detail of her past, every maneuver she executed, every moment in the cockpit was scrutinized, analyzed, celebrated. Emma had to remind herself to breathe, to step back, to remember she had saved lives and nothing else. Not fame, not adulation, was the goal. A reporter asked a question she hadn't expected. "Miss Reyes, some people are calling this a miracle. Do you feel like a miracle worker?" Emma paused, considering. She thought of the terrified faces on the plane, the sound of the engines, the feel of the controls beneath her hands. "Miracle," she said finally, "is when training, preparation, and instinct meet a situation that seems impossible. I didn't perform a miracle. I acted as any trained pilot would when lives depend on it. That's all I did." Her words struck a chord. Across news outlets, the phrase preparation, instinct, action became a mantra. Analysts dissected her response, emphasizing the discipline and courage it took to survive the storm and land the plane. Emma, the coffee server, had become more than a viral sensation. She was a symbol of calm, resilience, and quiet heroism. Later, in a quieter moment, she sat alone on a bench overlooking the tarmac. The Boeing 737 rested silently, storm-battered but intact. Emergency vehicles and personnel had begun clearing the scene, the hum of machinery fading. She allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had faced the storm, survived, saved 200 lives, and navigated the impossible. Yet she knew the storm of exposure, expectation, and public scrutiny would follow her always. Her phone buzzed again. A message from a former Air Force colleague read, "You showed the world what we already knew. Incredible work. You've inspired a nation. Be proud." Emma smiled faintly, holding the phone loosely in her hands. Pride was a complicated thing, mingled with exhaustion, humility, and relief. She had acted decisively when it mattered most, and the lives saved were the ultimate testament. Then came the final twist, the moment that would etch her story into legend. One of the airline executives approached, voice low but urgent. "Miss Reyes, the passengers want to meet you. All of them. They've been asking, saying they want to thank the pilot who saved them. They're assembled nearby." Emma's chest tightened. 200 faces, each one a story, a life she had preserved. She rose slowly, heart hammering, walking toward the gathered crowd. Families, children, elderly passengers, all eyes on her. Silence hung briefly before it erupted into applause, cries, and laughter. People waved, some fell to their knees in gratitude, others simply clutched each other. A young girl ran forward, holding a small drawing of an airplane, tears streaking her face. "You saved us," she cried. Emma knelt, taking the paper gently. "Yes," she said softly, "and you're safe now, that's what matters." One by one, passengers approached, words of thanks spilling out, hugs exchanged, tears flowing. Emma's heart swelled, a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and profound human connection. She realized something important. She hadn't just piloted a plane. She had guided people through fear, uncertainty, and the possibility of loss, and the gratitude she felt in return was beyond measure. Finally, as the crowd began to disperse, Emma stood alone for a moment, looking at the runway one last time. The storm had passed. 200 lives had survived. The world knew her secret. Her quiet life had ended, but something larger had begun. She whispered to herself, eyes fixed on the horizon, "I did what I had to do, and it was enough." And for the first time in a long time, Emma Reyes allowed herself to breathe fully, knowing that the coffee server who was secretly a pilot had faced the impossible, emerged victorious, and saved lives in a story the world would never forget.